When you imagine a Viking wedding, your mind might leap to roaring feasts, overflowing mugs of mead, and warriors clashing their shields in celebration. That image isn't entirely wrong, but the truth is both stranger and richer. A Viking wedding wasn't simply a day for romance. It was a carefully staged performance that balanced family honor, religion, politics, and community. To see a Viking wedding unfold is to see Viking society itself, with all its raw traditions and unspoken rules, packed into one event. Picture a longhouse at the edge of a fjord, smoke rising from the hearth as guests gather outside. The air is crisp, the mountains stand like eternal witnesses, and boats bob in the water, carrying relatives from far-off farms and settlements. A wedding was never small, even for a modest farmer's family. It was a moment that demanded spectacle, because marriage meant more than two people joining. It was the merging of lineages, the binding of wealth, land, and obligations. To decline such an invitation was almost unthinkable. At first glance, the scene feels festive. Children run between the guests, women carry baskets of bread and meat, and men boast loudly about hunts and raids. Yet beneath the laughter lies a current of solemnity. Everyone knows that this union has been negotiated for weeks, maybe months. Families met, matchmakers spoke, and the agreement was carefully drawn. A Viking wedding was never the sudden decision of two hearts. It was the outcome of calculated planning, and every guest understood the weight of what they were about to witness. As the bride prepares, hidden from view, her family carefully dresses her in garments, rich with meaning. Her hair is combed, often woven into elaborate braids, for in Viking culture, hair symbolized youth and strength. Sometimes, she wore a crown of herbs or a circlet of metal, meant to protect her against evil spirits. Everything she touched, from her shoes to her jewelry, carried ritual power. This was not merely decoration. This was armor against misfortune. The groom, meanwhile, was not idle. In some cases, he would undergo rituals of purification, bathing in cold water, or even cutting his hair and beard to signify stepping into a new stage of life. Weapons were often a part of his attire, not because he expected battle, but because they symbolized his ability to protect the new household he was about to form. For him, this day was not only about gaining a wife, it was about proving to the community that he was ready to carry the responsibilities of a husband. When guests saw them for the first time, walking into the longhouse where the feast would take place, there was a silence, brief but heavy. This was the first glimpse of the couple as they stepped into the roles prepared for them. And though the air would soon erupt with laughter, music, and drinking, that first glance was sacred. It was the moment where families saw their futures linked, where whispers of promises past turned into visible reality. You might imagine that a Viking wedding was just a wild party, and to be fair, the celebrations often stretched for days. But this first stage, the gathering, the glances, and the rituals of preparation, reminds us that it was not chaos. It was carefully staged tradition. The gods, the ancestors, and the community all had to be acknowledged before the drinking horns could truly be raised. In this way, a Viking wedding began not with joy but with gravity. Everyone present carried the weight of expectation. They knew this was not just about love, it was about survival, legacy, and honor. The first glance, then, was more than seeing a bride and groom. It was seeing the future of two families walking side by side, under the gaze of gods and men. If you want to understand Viking marriages, you have to forget the idea of weddings being purely about love. Love might have existed, yes, but it wasn't the foundation of marriage. What truly drove Viking weddings was alliance. A union was not only between a man and a woman, it was between two families, two networks of kinship, and sometimes even two rival groups trying to forge peace. When a Viking family discussed marriage, the first question was never, do they love each other? But rather, what do we gain? A marriage was a strategic move on the great chessboard of survival. If one family had fertile farmland but little protection, marrying into a family of warriors solved the problem. If another family held wealth but lacked influence, marrying into a clan of chieftains ensured both power and prestige. To refuse a marriage proposal without good reason could risk insult, and insult in Viking culture often led to blood feuds. The negotiations often began with a matchmaker or a respected elder who carried offers between families. These discussions were long and careful. The bride's family considered whether the groom's family was honorable, whether they had enemies, and whether their bloodline carried prestige. The groom's family, in turn, evaluated the bride's fertility, her skills in managing a household, and the wealth her dowry might bring. A marriage could not proceed until both sides agreed. And when they did, the terms were spoken aloud, sealed with handshakes and oaths. The bride and groom themselves had little say in this. Their duty was to accept the role chosen for them. Though resistance was not unheard of, in sagas, there are stories of women who rejected suitors. Sometimes with sharp words, sometimes even by threatening violence. Men, too, occasionally refused matches they found unfavorable. A wedding itself. This alliance was on display for all to see. Guests were not just there for the feast, they were witnesses to the new bond. When the bride crossed the threshold into her husband's household, she symbolically carried her family's honor into his home. And when the groom accepted her, he promised not only to care for her but to respect the ties between their clans. From that moment on, both families shared fortune and misfortune. If one suffered insult, the other was expected to defend them. If one prospered, the other shared in the spoils. Think of it as politics dressed in ritual. A Viking wedding was the closest thing to a treaty. Every piece of bread shared at the banquet, every horn of mead raised in toasts, was a reminder that this was about unity, and unity was survival. Life in the Viking Age was brutal. Famine, raids, and feuds could tear communities apart. To have allies was not a luxury. It was a necessity, of course. Not all marriages were made equal. Wealthy families with more to offer often secured the best matches, marrying into other powerful clans. Poorer families might arrange simpler unions, sometimes within the same village. But even the humblest farmer understood that a marriage was a thread in a larger web, connecting kin and weaving protection. It's easy, from the modern perspective, to see this as cold or transactional, but for the Vikings, it was the bedrock of their society. Marriage wasn't about a fleeting emotion. It was about building something that would outlast the individuals involved. A man might die in a raid, a woman might suffer hardship, but the alliance would endure, binding families for generations. And so, when people gathered at a wedding, they weren't just watching two young people start their lives together. They were watching a contract of survival take shape. The smiles, the laughter, and the feasting made it joyous. But beneath it all, the meaning was as heavy as iron. A Viking marriage was never small. It was family. It was politics. It was legacy. It was, above all else, alliance. Behind every Viking wedding, there was usually someone working in the shadows to bring it all together. This wasn't a romantic poet whispering about love, nor a priest binding two souls with divine blessing. It was the matchmaker. If marriages were alliances, then the matchmaker was the diplomat who set the pieces in motion. In Viking society, family honor was everything. A poorly chosen marriage could weaken a family's standing, while the right match could elevate it for generations. Parents often turned to respected elders, relatives, or community leaders to act as intermediaries in arranging unions. These matchmakers weren't just busybodies sticking their noses into family business. They were trusted voices who could cross the gap between two households, carrying proposals and counteroffers with tact and care. The process began quietly. One family, perhaps seeing an opportunity to expand their influence or strengthen their protection, would reach out through the matchmaker. The matchmaker's task was to speak with authority but not arrogance, to present the family's interest without making it sound like a demand. Every word mattered. To propose a match was to step into delicate territory. A refusal could insult. An insult could ignite feuds. The matchmaker had to know how to phrase an offer so that even rejection would not lead to dishonor. The bride price was at the center of it. This was not a purchase, as some might assume, but a form of security wealth offered by the groom's family to the bride's family, symbolizing commitment and respect. Alongside this came the dowry, wealth or goods given with the bride, often in the form of land, livestock, or household items. These exchanges were not simple economics. They were symbolic gestures that said, We give you wealth to show we value your daughter, and we send her with gifts to show her worth and status. The matchmaker oversaw these negotiations like a commander directing troops. He or she ensured that both families left the table with pride intact. Too low an offer would be an insult. Too high might signal desperation or weaken the groom's household. The balance had to be perfect. A good matchmaker was remembered with gratitude, while a poor one might carry the blame for years of tension. But it wasn't just about wealth. The matchmaker also navigated questions of honor and lineage. Was the bride's family known for loyalty? Were there enemies who might complicate the union? Was the groom of sound character able to support a household? Stories of ancestors, reputations in the village, even rumors from raids could all sway the discussions. The matchmaker's role was to weigh these factors and bring them into conversation without causing offense. When an agreement was finally reached, it was not sealed with signatures on parchment. The Vikings preferred oaths, spoken in front of witnesses, a handshake, a pledge by the gods, sometimes even a symbolic exchange of weapons or gifts. These gestures had more weight than paper ever could. In Viking culture, breaking an oath was one of the greatest shames a person could bear. Once the match was agreed upon, both families were bound to honor it. The matchmaker's role did not always end there. Some stayed involved through the preparations, advising on proper rituals and ensuring that the alliance began smoothly. Others stepped back, satisfied that their part was done. Either way, their work left fingerprints on the entire wedding. Without them, many unions would never have taken place. It's worth remembering that the matchmaker's power went beyond logistics. They shaped the fabric of Viking society. By guiding marriages, they guided alliances, and by guiding alliances, they influenced the direction of villages, clans, and sometimes even kingdoms. A skilled matchmaker could prevent feuds, secure peace, and weave together the networks that held communities together. So when we think of Viking weddings, we should not picture only the bride in her crown of herbs, or the groom with his sword. Behind them stood the unseen architect, the matchmaker, who ensured that the promises spoken beneath the rafters of the longhouse would not unravel. The wedding feast might be remembered for its music, its laughter, and its overflowing horns of mead. But the true foundation was laid in those careful negotiations, word by word, bargain by bargain. The matchmaker was no romantic. They were practical, shrewd, and absolutely essential. Without them, there was no wedding, no alliance, and no future for the families involved. If you've ever imagined Viking weddings as wild feasts filled with drinking horns and rowdy laughter, you wouldn't be wrong. But what often gets overlooked is the business side of it all. Before the feasting came negotiations, and at the heart of these negotiations were the dowry and the bride price. To us today, these might sound like outdated or even cold-hearted transactions, but in Viking society they carried deep cultural meaning and were essential to the survival and honor of both families. Let's start with the bride price. This was the gift the groom's family gave to the bride's family, and it wasn't just about money or wealth. It was a public statement that said, "We value your daughter, and we are committed to taking her into our household with respect." Think of it less as a purchase and more as a form of assurance. The bride price guaranteed that the groom's family recognized the worth of the woman joining them. To skip, it would have been a huge insult, one that could destroy the alliance before it even began. The amount of the bride price varied. A wealthy farmer or chieftain might offer silver coins, finely forged weapons, or even land. Others might pay in cattle, which were just as valuable in a world where survival depended on livestock. But the gesture mattered just as much as the wealth itself. Too low a bride price suggested disrespect. Too high could raise eyebrows, making it look like the groom's family was desperate or trying too hard to impress. Balance was everything. Then there was the dowry, which came from the bride's side. This was the wealth or goods she brought into the marriage, and it served a practical purpose. The dowry helped set up the new household, ensuring the couple could start their life together with security. It might include livestock, a chest of clothing and jewelry, land rights, or household items like finely woven blankets and tools. In some cases, even slaves could be part of the dowry, though this reflected the harsher realities of Viking society. But, beyond the practical, the dowry was also symbolic. It showed the status of the bride's family. A rich dowry signaled that the bride came from wealth and influence, elevating her standing in her husband's household. For the bride herself, the dowry was a form of insurance. If her husband died or the marriage dissolved, she often had a right to reclaim her dowry. In a world where widows needed protection and security, the dowry could be a lifeline together. The bride price and the dowry created a balance. The groom's family gave wealth to show respect, while the bride's family gave wealth to strengthen the couple's new household. It wasn't just an exchange of goods, it was an exchange of trust. Each family demonstrated that they were serious about the alliance, committed to ensuring the couple would not start their life together empty-handed. These practices also had ripple effects across Viking society. The circulation of wealth through marriage helped redistribute resources, strengthen ties between families, and reinforce the honor system that kept communities stable. To us it may sound transactional, but to the Vikings it was sacred. A well-arranged bride price and dowry could cement peace between rival clans, end feuds, or even expand a family's influence into new territories. There's also an interesting gender dynamic at play here. Viking women weren't passive participants in these negotiations. While their families often arranged the match, women had legal rights to their dowries. In some cases, if a woman felt slighted, if her dowry was mishandled, or her husband failed to respect her rights, she could take legal action. That may not sound revolutionary today, but in the early medieval world, this level of agency was remarkable. It shows that Viking marriages, while practical and rooted in alliance building, did not strip women of their importance. It's important to understand that these exchanges weren't cold or loveless. Many Viking marriages likely developed into genuine partnerships, and love may have blossomed after the vows were spoken. But first came honor, stability, and wealth. The ingredients that made survival possible in a world where winter could kill and feuds could erupt at any moment. So the next time you imagine a Viking wedding, don't just picture the laughter, the clinking of mead horns, or the glow of firelight inside a smoky longhouse. Picture the quiet negotiations before the feast. The bride's family laying out chests of woven cloth, the groom's family presenting silver or cattle, the matchmaker nodding with satisfaction as both sides reached agreement. That was where the marriage truly began, in the careful balance of giving and receiving, in the promises spoken through wealth and honor. Without the bride price and the dowry, the feast would have been meaningless. Together, they were the foundation of the marriage, the glue that held the new household together, and the assurance that both families walked away respected. To the Vikings, this was not just tradition, it was survival. If you were a Viking family preparing for a wedding, you didn't just pick any random day and call it good. No, the timing of a wedding was one of the most important decisions you could make. And for the Vikings, timing meant everything. Marry on the wrong day, and you risked bad luck. Infertility or a marriage doomed from the start. Choose wisely, and you set the couple up for prosperity, strength, and harmony. The first thing you had to know was this: never, under any circumstances, hold a wedding in winter. Winter was the season of death, darkness, and hardship. It was when food stores ran low, when sickness spread, and when travel was dangerous. A marriage was supposed to be a union of life, fertility, and growth. To tie the knot in the cold months was like planting seeds in frozen soil. It simply wasn't done. Instead, weddings were held in summer, and even better, in late summer. This was after the harvest, when food was plentiful and mead could flow freely. Crops had been gathered, animals fattened, and households were flush with the bounty of the season. A summer wedding didn't just make sense logistically, it carried powerful symbolic weight. What better time to start a marriage than during the season of plenty? Guests could eat until they burst, drink without fear of scarcity, and celebrate without worrying about snowstorms outside the longhouse. But the season wasn't the only factor. The Vikings also paid attention to the day of the week. Some days were considered luckier than others. Friday, for example, was sacred to the goddess Frigg, wife of Odin and a deity associated with marriage, love, and fertility. To marry on Frigg's Day was to call down her blessing on the union. It was believed she would guide the couple toward harmony and prosperity, just as she herself embodied the ideal of the wise and steadfast wife. Other days, however, carried a darker reputation. Wednesday, tied to Odin, might be powerful, but also unpredictable. Odin was a god of wisdom, yes, but also of war and cunning. To marry on his day could invite chaos or too much ambition into the union. And Saturday, often linked to Loki in some traditions, was flat out avoided. Loki's trickster nature made him a dangerous figure to invoke during a wedding. No one wanted mischief woven into the very fabric of their marriage, beyond days and seasons. The Vikings also looked to the skies. They watched the phases of the moon, believing that certain phases carried good fortune. A waxing moon, when the moon was growing fuller each night, was the ideal time for a wedding. It symbolized growth, increase, and abundance. A waning moon, on the other hand, symbolized decline and loss. And no family wanted their union to begin with that kind of omen hanging overhead. Astrology also played its part. Though not in the way we imagine today, the Vikings had their own ways of reading the heavens, paying attention to celestial signs, and aligning them with mythic stories. A comet or strange star in the sky could delay a wedding, while a bright, clear night was taken as approval from the gods. To ignore these signs was to tempt fate. And fate, the Norns who wove the destiny of all beings, was not to be trifled with. Of course, practical matters also factored in. A wedding meant travel, and Viking families often lived miles apart, connected by rugged trails or waterways. The best time to host a wedding was when roads were clear, rivers calm, and seas navigable. This wasn't just superstition, it was survival. You couldn't have a proper wedding without guests, and you certainly couldn't have one without the vital exchange of dowry and bride price. Summer offered both safety and abundance, and so it became the season of love. The careful choice of the wedding day reveals a lot about how the Vikings thought. Marriage wasn't just a private matter, it was cosmic. It had to align with the cycles of the earth, the rhythms of the sky, and the will of the gods. Every detail carried meaning, and every choice was loaded with potential consequences. When a bride and groom stood before their kin, they weren't just promising themselves to each other, they were stepping into a web of destiny, luck, and divine favor. So picture it. The air warm with late, summer sunlight, fields golden from harvest, and the longhouse filled with guests who had traveled safely under clear skies. It's Friday, Frigg's Day, the waxing moon glows above, and the families know they've chosen well. The bride walks toward her new life with blessings woven into every step, and the groom welcomes her with the confidence that the gods, the seasons, and fate itself are on their side. To us it might sound like superstition. To the Vikings, it was wisdom. Choosing the right day wasn't about fear. It was about harmony, aligning human life with the great cycles of the natural and spiritual world. And in a world as dangerous and uncertain as theirs, who wouldn't want every possible advantage? A Viking wedding was never just a family affair. It was, at its heart, a sacred contract witnessed by the gods themselves to the Vikings. Marriage was more than two people joining their lives. It was a spiritual bond, one that needed divine approval. Without it, the marriage wasn't just unlucky, it was incomplete. The centerpiece of every sacred Viking wedding was sacrifice. And no, this didn't mean the groom had to give up drinking for life, or the bride had to stop scolding her brothers. This was literal sacrifice, blood spilled to honor the gods. Usually this came in the form of animals, most often a pig or a goat. Their blood was caught in bowls and then sprinkled, or fate, on the altar, the wedding party, and sometimes even the house. It wasn't gruesome for them, it was holy. Blood was life, and by sharing it with the gods, the Vikings were asking for fertility, protection, and strength for the new couple. One god loomed larger than the rest during weddings. Thor, yes. The hammer-swinging thunder god wasn't just a hero of battles. He was also a guardian of brides. His hammer, Failnir, symbolized fertility, protection, and power. At weddings, replicas of Thor's hammer were placed on the bride's lap or hung around her neck to ensure she would be fertile and her household strong. Some sagas even tell of mock rituals where the hammer was blessed over the bride's womb, a vivid reminder of just how closely fertility and faith were tied. But Thor wasn't alone at these ceremonies. Frigg, the goddess of marriage and motherhood, was silently invoked through timing and prayers. Freyja, goddess of love and beauty, was also honored. Her blessings asked to make the union one of passion as well as partnership. And then there was Freyr, Freyja's brother, a fertility god, who embodied prosperity, growth, and the bounty of the earth. A good marriage, after all, wasn't just about children. It was about land, wealth, and strong harvests. Invoking Freyr meant the couple's household would be as fruitful as the fields. The ceremonies themselves could be simple or elaborate, depending on the wealth of the families. At the heart of it, though, there was always a shared cup of mead. The bride and groom would drink from the same horn, a ritual act symbolizing their new union. Mead wasn't just alcohol, it was honey wine, sweet and golden, thought to hold magical properties of blessing and abundance. Sharing it meant blending their fates together. From that moment, their lives were intertwined. There were also oaths. The groom swore to provide for and protect his bride, while the bride swore loyalty and partnership. These weren't spoken lightly. In Viking culture, an oath was binding not just between people, but before the gods. To break, it was to invite ruin, not just on yourself, but on your entire household. Guests bore witness, ensuring the words carried weight, and some sagas hint that tokens or runes were exchanged, serving as physical reminders of the vows. The setting of the ceremony was equally important. If the family was wealthy, it might take place at a hof, a temple dedicated to the gods. But more often, the longhouse itself was transformed into a sacred space. Sprigs of evergreen might be hung for protection, animal sacrifices offered at makeshift altars, and sacred fires lit to carry prayers upward. Everything, from the smell of roasted meat to the glow of torchlight, was meant to weave human celebration with divine presence. What's striking is how seamlessly the sacred blended with the practical. The Vikings didn't see religion as separate from daily life. Every feast, every oath, every cup of mead had a spiritual dimension. A wedding was simply the most concentrated version of this worldview. To them, failing to involve the gods wasn't just a bad idea, it was unthinkable. The gods were family, they had to be present. And so, as the bride sat with Thor's hammer in her lap, as mead was passed, as blood was sprinkled to honor Freyr and Freyja, the entire gathering was reminded of what was at stake. This wasn't just a new couple starting their life together. It was the weaving of fate, a sacred tapestry where gods, ancestors, and kin all played a part. To modern eyes, it may seem brutal or strange, but for the Vikings, it was beautiful. Life was harsh, unpredictable, and often short. To invite the gods into a wedding was to ask them to steady the path ahead, to bless the harvests, to safeguard the children, and to ensure that the fire of the hearth never went out. So when we picture a Viking wedding, we shouldn't just imagine feasting and laughter, we should see the solemnity too. The bride holding MJ Fainir, the mead horn passing between hands, the smoke rising from sacrifices, and the whispered prayers to Freyja and Frigg. Because for the Vikings, a marriage without the gods was no marriage at all. In Viking culture, a wedding was not just a contract between families or a celebration of love. It was a rite of passage, and no one embodied that transformation more vividly than the bride. For her, the wedding marked a complete shift, from daughter of her father's household to the lady of a new home, and every detail of her preparation reflected this enormous change. The night before the wedding, the bride underwent a ritual cleansing. Sometimes, this meant bathing in water believed to be sacred or infused with herbs. In a society where daily baths were rare luxuries, this cleansing wasn't just about hygiene, it was symbolic. She was washing away her old life, her childhood, and her ties to her father's household. What emerged from the bath was someone new, ready to step into her role as a wife. And soon enough, as a mother. Her hair played a central role in this transformation. Among the Vikings, hair was more than just fashion, it was identity. Unmarried women often wore their hair loose, flowing down their backs as a sign of maidenhood. But on her wedding day, the bride's hair was braided and carefully arranged, often by female relatives or close friends. This wasn't a casual makeover, it was a ritual, symbolizing her shift from a free maiden to a married woman. The act itself carried deep meaning. She was literally being woven into a new role, her hair strands becoming a metaphor for the weaving of fate. Jewelry also told the story of transformation. Viking brides were often adorned with gifts of silver or gold, not just as decoration but as powerful symbols. Brooches, beads, and arm rings were displayed proudly, signaling the wealth and status of her family. But one item stood out above all others: the bridal crown. In some traditions, brides wore ornate crowns decorated with flowers, metalwork, or even glass beads. It wasn't simply pretty. It was protective. Crowns were thought to ward off evil spirits and ensure fertility. In some sagas, a bride's crown was considered so sacred that it could later be used as an offering at the temple. And then came the bridal belt. If hair symbolized maidenhood and jewelry represented wealth, the belt was about fertility. It was tied around the bride's waist, often with charms or runes stitched into it, and it signified her readiness to bear children. After the wedding, this belt was sometimes passed down to future daughters, carrying with it generations of blessings. The most striking part of the transformation, however, was the passing of weapons. In a deeply symbolic act, the bride's father might hand over her keys, the keys to his household, to his storerooms, to his authority, and give them to the groom. At the same time, the groom might give the bride a sword, often a family heirloom. This wasn't a weapon she was expected to wield in battle. Instead, it symbolized the merging of their households. She received his strength, and he entrusted her with the management of his home. Together, they formed a balance: the warrior outside, the keeper inside. But let's not imagine this as cold or impersonal. For the bride, this was a moment heavy with meaning. Every braid in her hair, every jewel on her body, every ritual she performed was a reminder that she was stepping into a role filled with responsibility, honor, and expectation. She wasn't just becoming a wife. She was becoming the heart of a new family, the guardian of its hearth, the mother of its future. Guests saw it too. When the bride finally appeared, transformed and adorned, she wasn't just a woman walking into a feast. She was a living symbol of transition, fertility, and continuity. Her new household looked to her not just for meals and management, but as the carrier of legacy. The Vikings understood that weddings weren't simply about two people. They were about the future of clans, the weaving of bloodlines, and the perpetuation of names and reputations. The bride stood at the center of all this, her transformation embodying the bridge between what was and what was to come. So when we think of a Viking wedding, we shouldn't just picture laughter, feasting, and mead horns raised high. We should imagine that quiet, solemn moment when the bride stepped forward, cleansed, braided, crowned, and belted, no longer her father's daughter, but the mistress of her own hall, the symbol of a new chapter in the saga of her people. While the bride's transformation was filled with ritual, symbolism, and the weaving of new identity, the groom had his own path to walk on the day of the wedding. If the bride was the heart of the new household, the groom was expected to be its shield. His preparation reflected this role, blending personal transformation with the ideals of honor, strength, and responsibility that defined Viking masculinity. The night before the wedding, the groom often underwent cleansing rituals of his own. He might visit a bathhouse or wash in a nearby stream, sometimes accompanied by male relatives or close friends. Just like the bride, this wasn't simply about washing away dirt. It was about washing away his old life, leaving behind the days of being only a son or a free man, and stepping into the role of a husband and future father. This cleansing marked his readiness to lead his own household, and to stand as the protector of his new family. Weapons played a central role in the groom's symbolism. Vikings lived in a world where strength and survival were inseparable. And so a man's sword or axe was more than a tool of war. It was a reflection of his honor. On his wedding day, the groom might carry a family sword passed down through generations to signify continuity and tradition. This wasn't just for show. It told the bride's family that their daughter was joining a line of warriors, men who had earned respect and who had the strength to defend what was theirs. There was also the exchange of gifts between bride and groom. The groom might give the bride a sword, symbolizing that she now carried his honor and his lineage within her new role. In return, the bride sometimes presented him with weapons or items that linked her family's legacy to his. This exchange created a bond that was not just emotional, but deeply symbolic. Two families uniting under the promise of loyalty, defense, and prosperity. The groom's clothing also reflected his new status. while Viking men did not typically dress in elaborate garments every day. Weddings were an exception. On this day, he wore his finest tunic, often dyed in bold colors if his family could afford it. Bright reds, blues, or greens might be chosen, colors that symbolized vitality, strength, and wealth. His cloak might be lined with fur, both practical for the cold and symbolic of his ability to provide. Jewelry like brooches, arm rings, or necklaces also came into play, often gifts from family members meant to highlight his status and reinforce his responsibilities. But the most important part of the groom's role wasn't his clothing or even his weapons. It was his ability to stand publicly as a man ready to take responsibility. Weddings were often community events, with dozens or even hundreds of people present. When the groom appeared before this crowd, he was presenting himself not just to the bride but to the entire community. His honor, his family's reputation, and his ability to provide and protect were all under scrutiny. There were also rituals that tied the groom directly to fertility and the future. In some traditions, he carried a hammer or an object associated with Thor, the god of thunder and fertility. By invoking Thor, the groom symbolically asked for strength, protection, and blessings for many children to come. This gesture wasn't just personal faith, it was reassurance to the bride's family that he would ensure the survival and prosperity of their line. The core of all of this was responsibility. For Viking men, marriage was not just about love or companionship, it was about duty. The groom was expected to provide food, defend the household, and maintain the honor of both families. If he failed, it wasn't just a private matter, it was a public shame. And so, while the bride's transformation emphasized her role as the keeper of the hearth and the bearer of future generations, the groom's transformation placed him firmly as the warrior, the protector, and the provider. Both roles were different, but they were complementary. Together, they created balance, a partnership that would sustain not just two people, but entire families and future generations. So when you picture a Viking wedding, imagine the groom standing tall, dressed in his finest sword in hand and cloak across his shoulders. Around him, the murmurs of guests. Before him, the bride adorned in her crown and belt. Two symbols, two roles, about to merge into one household for the groom. This was not just a moment of joy. It was the weight of responsibility resting firmly on his shoulders, and the beginning of a new chapter where his strength and honor would be tested every day. If the ceremony of a Viking wedding was the Sacred Heart, then the feast was its roaring soul. After oaths were exchanged and blessings invoked, the community shifted from solemn ritual to raucous celebration. It was here that the seriousness of marriage transformed into joy, laughter, and the binding of two families through food, drink, and revelry. The feast did not happen in a quiet corner. It was loud, alive, and bursting with the spirit of the people. Guests gathered in a great hall if one was available, its wooden beams hung with shields and tapestries, or else in large outdoor gatherings under open skies where fires blazed high and the scent of roasting meat drifted through the air. Long wooden tables were set, benches lined with fur to ward off the chill, and torches or oil lamps cast a flickering glow that added to the festive mood. Food was the centerpiece, and no ordinary fare would do. A wedding demanded abundance, both to honor the gods and to prove the prosperity of the families. Great platters of roasted boar, venison, and lamb were carried into the hall. Whole fish fresh from the sea or river glistened with herbs, while breads baked with honey and grains were passed down the tables. Bowls overflowed with berries, nuts, and cheeses, and rich stews simmered in cauldrons, their savory aroma filling every corner of the gathering. But no Viking feast was complete without drink, and mead was king of them all. Brewed from honey, water, and herbs, mead was more than just a sweet drink. It was believed to carry divine blessings, connecting the drinker to the gods themselves. Horns brimming with mead were passed around, and each sip was more than refreshment. It was a toast to the future, to fertility, to peace, and to prosperity. Ale and sometimes imported wines made their appearance too. But mead always held pride of place, its golden hue shimmering in the firelight. The toasts themselves were as important as the drink. The first horn was often dedicated to the gods, Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength and fertility, and Freyja for love. Then came toasts to the families, to the bride and groom, to ancestors long gone but not forgotten. Each toast was a way of weaving blessings into the fabric of the marriage, ensuring that the couple carried the strength of their people into their shared life. Music soon followed, and with it, laughter. Skalds, the Viking poets and storytellers, rose to recite verses that praised the bride and groom, sang of heroic ancestors, or told bawdy tales that made guests roar with amusement. Musicians played harps, lyres, and flutes, while drums pounded rhythms that invited dancing. The hall shook with voices raised in song, the stamping of boots, and the clashing of mugs against tables. The bride and groom themselves were central to the celebration, but they were not passive participants. They joined the laughter, raised horns in toast, and shared bites of food with their guests. Their union was no longer just a private bond. It was a public joy, one that bound not only their lives but also the fortunes of both families. The feast often lasted not just for hours but for days. In some cases, 3 days of celebration were considered proper for a wedding of standing, while others stretched even longer. Guests traveled from far and wide, and it would have been unthinkable to host such a journey for a mere evening's entertainment. Each day brought fresh food, renewed drinking, and more entertainment, ensuring that everyone left with memories that would linger for years. Of course, the feast was not merely an indulgence. It had purpose. By gathering the community, it allowed everyone to witness the strength of the bond being formed. It reinforced alliances, soothed tensions between families, and reminded all that while marriages were made between two individuals, they were also agreements that carried weight for entire clans. Yet, despite all its deeper meaning, the feast was also pure joy. Imagine the glow of firelight flickering across smiling faces, the sounds of laughter echoing through the hall, and the sight of the bride and groom seated in places of honor, surrounded by those who wished them well, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and honeyed mead, the night alive with song and dance. It was a moment when hardship and struggle fell away, replaced by abundance and shared happiness. So when we speak of Viking weddings, we cannot separate the sacred from the celebratory. The feast was as vital as the oaths, for it was here that the community rejoiced together, here that bonds were strengthened, and here that the new couple was welcomed, not just with ritual, but with joy. If one symbol defined the Viking wedding feast, it was the mead. Sweet, golden, and potent. Mead was more than a drink. It was a ritual in liquid form, the very essence of prosperity and divine blessing poured into a horn. At a wedding, the mead cup was raised again and again, but each time it carried weight and meaning far beyond simple merriment. The ritual of drinking mead at weddings has deep roots in Norse tradition. Mead was considered a gift from the gods, especially connected to fertility and abundance. Honey, the key ingredient, was itself tied to sweetness, prosperity, and the cycles of nature. When brewed into mead, it became a drink that linked human celebration with divine approval. To drink mead at a wedding was to drink in the favor of the gods, ensuring that the new couple would be fruitful, prosperous, and strong. The first toast was never casual. It belonged to the gods, and it was offered with reverence. Odin, the All-Father, was honored for his wisdom and guidance, a blessing for the couple as they embarked on their shared journey. Thor, with his mighty hammer, was invoked for strength, protection, and fertility, qualities needed both in marriage and in the challenges of Viking life. Freyja, goddess of love and beauty, was called upon to bless the bond of affection and desire between the newlyweds. Each god carried their part, and with every name spoken, the community affirmed their role in the marriage's success. The second round of toasts was for the ancestors. Viking culture placed enormous importance on lineage and heritage. To raise a horn to those who had come before was to acknowledge that the couple did not stand alone. They were the continuation of a line, the living embodiment of their family's past, in a world where memory was a kind of immortality. Speaking the names of ancestors at a wedding gave strength to their spirits and tied their blessings to the union. Then came the most personal toast, the one to the bride and groom themselves. Here, the community poured its heart into the marriage. Elders gave advice, warriors wished strength, mothers prayed for children, and friends shouted their goodwill. Some of these toasts were heartfelt, others humorous, but all carried the same intention: to surround the couple with layers of blessing and support. The bride and groom, too, had their part in this ritual. They would each drink from the mead horn, often sharing it, as a symbol of their new unity. In some traditions, they drank for a set number of nights after the wedding, a practice believed to aid in conception and ensure the birth of strong heirs. It's from this custom that we get the term honeymoon, a month of honey, or mead, drinking after the marriage. But toasts were not limited to formality. As the mead flowed, the mood shifted from solemn blessings to raucous humor. Skalds, poets, and warriors would rise mead, horn in hand, to tell stories, boast of deeds, or tease the couple with playful jests. These speeches could be bold, even scandalous, but they were all part of the atmosphere. A Viking feast was never a stiff, silent affair. It was alive, vibrant, filled with the pulse of human voices celebrating together. Yet beneath the laughter, the symbolism remained. Every horn of mead passed was another layer of blessing, another tie binding the couple to their gods, ancestors, and community. It was a kind of living oath, not carved in stone, but carried in the hearts of those who drank together. The mead ritual was also a reminder that while marriage was sacred, it was also practical. Mead was nourishment, warmth in the cold, and a sign of wealth. To offer it in such abundance at a wedding showed that the families could provide for their people. In a land where survival was never guaranteed, this generosity was not only admired, it was essential. So, when we think of Viking weddings, it's not just about the roaring fires, the laughter, or the music, it's about the mead, sweet, golden, and overflowing. It was the lifeblood of the celebration, carrying with it blessings that reached far beyond the hall. It was the taste of love, of family, of community, and of divine approval, all captured in a single drink. In the glow of the feast hall, as horn after horn was raised high, and the voices of the guests rang out, the mead transformed from simple honey wine into a sacred thread, and through it, the bond of marriage was woven stronger, one sip at a time. Once the solemn vows were spoken, and the sacred toasts with mead were complete. A Viking wedding did what every proper gathering in the Northlands did. It turned into a festival of games, contests, and endless entertainment. A wedding wasn't just about binding two people together. It was about binding the entire community through laughter, competition, and shared joy. Entertainment at a Viking wedding was not a side detail. It was a critical part of the celebration. These people lived in a world where winter could lock them inside their halls for months, where food was never guaranteed, and where war and sea voyages could take loved ones without warning. So when the chance to feast and celebrate arrived, it was embraced with a ferocity equal to battle. Weddings were one of those rare occasions when the entire community could drop its burdens and revel together. Strength contests were a favorite. Young warriors eager to show off in front of their peers, and perhaps impress a maiden or two, would challenge one another to trials of muscle. Wrestling matches were common, held right there on the packed dirt of the hall, or in the courtyard outside. Men would lock arms, grapple, and try to throw each other with shouts and cheers rising from the crowd. Sometimes they wrestled bare-handed, sometimes with cloaks wrapped around their arms. Either way, the point was clear: strength and skill earned respect. Stone lifting was another popular contest. A massive stone, sometimes as heavy as a man, would be brought out, and the challengers would take turns attempting to lift it to their chest, or even higher. The ability to raise the stone was not just for bragging rights. It was seen as proof of manhood, endurance, and fitness for battle. Imagine the roar of approval when a groom himself hefted the wedding stone before the crowd, proving that he was not only worthy of his bride, but capable of defending her and their household. There were contests of wit as well. The Vikings adored skalds, poets, and storytellers who could spin words into weapons sharper than steel. At weddings they often engaged in flyting, a kind of verbal duel. Two men, or sometimes two women, would stand and hurl insults, boasts, or clever verses at each other, while the audience howled with laughter at the creativity and sting of the lines. A well-aimed insult was as respected as a well-thrown spear. The bride and groom were often the subject of these verses too, teased affectionately in a way that tied them into the fun. Not all contests were so fierce. There were games of chance and light-hearted challenges that anyone could join. Dice games rolled across the tables. Mock sword fights broke out between boys with wooden staves. Even foot races and tug-of-war contests might spill out into the yard, where guests of all ages joined the fun. These games were more than amusement. They reminded everyone that joy and play were as important to life as duty and war. And then there was the music. No Viking feast was complete without it. Harps, fiddles, and drums filled the hall, while singers raised their voices in songs of heroes, gods, and lovers. Sometimes the songs were ancient ballads, carrying the weight of tradition. Other times they were body-drinking songs, designed to make the guests roar with laughter and spill their mead. Guests danced in the firelight, stamping their feet, clapping, and spinning until the hall shook with energy. The bride and groom were not passive observers in this revelry. They were often drawn into the contests, cheered on in dances, teased in poems, and honored with games staged in their name. Their union was not only solemn but playful, not only blessed but celebrated with gusto. To see the couple laugh together, dance together, and share in the joy of their people was to confirm that the marriage was truly whole. Even the gods, it was believed, delighted in these games. Strength, wit, music, and laughter were all gifts from the divine, and to exercise them in celebration was to honor those gifts. The clashing of wrestlers, the ringing of verses, the pounding of drums, all of it was a tribute to life itself, carried out under the watchful eyes of both the ancestors and the gods. So when the fire roared high in the wedding hall, when sweat shone on the wrestlers' shoulders, when poets stung each other with clever barbs, and when dancers spun until the floorboards creaked, the Viking wedding became more than a ritual. It was a living festival, proof that, in a world of hardship and uncertainty, the people of the North knew how to celebrate with a fierceness equal to their battles. Because in the end, a wedding was not just about survival or duty, it was about joy. And joy in Viking culture was never a small, quiet thing. It was loud, competitive, fiery, and unforgettable. If the games and contests were the fire of a Viking wedding, the feast was its heart. The tables groaned with food, the benches filled with guests, and the air thickened with the smell of roasted meat, baked bread, and sweet mead. For the Vikings, a wedding without an overflowing table was no wedding at all. The feast wasn't simply a meal, it was a performance, a display of wealth, generosity, and symbolic meaning in every dish. Picture the longhouse glowing with torchlight, the fire pit blazing, and the bride and groom seated in honor at the high table. Around them, family, friends, warriors, and travelers filled the benches, eager to eat their fill. The host of the feast, the family of the bride or groom, had the sacred duty to provide abundance. If the food ran out too soon, it would be a mark of shame. A proper feast had to last, sometimes for several days, ensuring that no guest left hungry or thirsty. At the center of the feast was meat. Roasted boar, venison, lamb, or beef were carved and passed down the tables. Hunting had its place in Viking life, but weddings called for animals raised, fattened, and slaughtered specifically for the occasion. A bride's family might save a prized animal for years, just to make the wedding feast shine. Meat represented prosperity and strength. To feed so much of it to so many mouths was to declare that the new household would be bountiful and secure. Fish was common too, especially in coastal regions. Whole salmon roasted over open flames, or herring preserved in brine, reminded everyone of the sea's gifts. Bread and porridge provided the base of the meal, made from barley, oats, or rye. These grains were not luxurious, but they were essential, the steady, daily food of the people. Serving them in abundance reminded guests that the marriage was not only about wealth and glory, but about sustaining the basics of life. Symbolism ran deep in what was served. Apples often appeared, linked to Idun, the goddess of youth and immortality. To eat apples at a wedding was to wish for long life and enduring love. Honey cakes and pastries symbolized sweetness in marriage. Goat's meat and cheese called to mind Thor's goats, which he slaughtered and resurrected, a sign of renewal, resilience, and divine blessing. And then, there was the mead. If bread was the body of the feast, mead was its soul. Golden, rich, and brewed from honey, It carried both literal sweetness and spiritual power. Mead was believed to be a gift from the gods, a drink that warmed the heart, inspired the poet, and bound the people together in joy. Drinking horns were filled, lifted, and passed again and again. The bride and groom shared from the same horn, sealing their union not just in ritual, but in every sip. The mead also had another role: fertility. Mead was tied to the cycles of life, to the fertility of fields, animals, and people. Newlyweds were encouraged to drink deeply, and the tradition of the honeymoon comes from this practice. For a full month after the wedding, the couple was expected to drink mead daily, ensuring that their union would produce children and secure the family's legacy. The act of feasting together was itself symbolic. To break bread at the same table was to recognize bonds of kinship and loyalty. In Viking culture, hospitality was sacred, and to feed someone under your roof created a tie that could not be easily broken. By inviting the entire community, the families of the bride and groom declared that this marriage belonged to all. Every guest who ate, drank, and laughed at the table was now bound to witness, support, and honor the union. Of course, excess was part of the fun. Feasts were about showing off, and hosts competed to impress. Exotic foods from distant lands, spices, dried fruits, even wine, sometimes appeared, brought by traders who had sailed as far as Byzantium. Their presence on the table was a sign of status, proof that the family had reach and wealth enough to bring the world to their hearth. But no matter how lavish the spread, it wasn't only about luxury. Every bite carried meaning, every dish a blessing. The bride and groom ate surrounded by their kin, blessed by gods, watched by ancestors, and celebrated by neighbors. In that moment, as the mead flowed and the firelight danced across the rafters, the feast became more than a meal. It became a promise that life, like the table, would be abundant, and that marriage would be filled with both the daily bread and the honeyed sweetness of joy. Because in the Viking world, love was not fragile. It was built on strength, sustained by food, and sanctified by the feast. If the feast filled stomachs, the drinking rituals bound souls. At Viking weddings, raising a horn was not just about getting tipsy. It was sacred, serious, and woven into the fabric of honor. Every gulp of mead came with words, and every word carried weight. To drink together was to create a pact, one that tied gods, ancestors, and mortals in a web of promises that no one dared break. Picture the longhouse alive with laughter. But when the drinking ritual began, the mood shifted. A hush fell. Horns were filled, and the first to rise was often the groom. He would lift his horn high, not casually, but with solemnity, and swear his first toast to Odin, chief of the gods. Odin was the patron of wisdom, war, and poetry, the very pillars of Viking life. To invoke him was to seek guidance, protection, and perhaps a touch of his cunning for the trials of marriage ahead. After Odin, other gods were honored. Thor, with his hammer, was toasted for strength, fertility, and protection against chaos. Frey and Freyja, gods of fertility and love, received their share of mead as well. Each god was called upon in turn, their names spilling into the smoky air, carried upward with the breath of the drinkers. To leave a god out was unthinkable, but the toasts weren't only to gods. Ancestors, too, were honored. The dead were believed to watch over the living, and their blessing was as vital as any gods the groom might call on his grandfather, a warrior slain in battle, asking him to watch over the union. The bride might toast her grandmother, known for her wisdom and household strength. With every name spoken, the invisible presence of the dead grew stronger in the hall. Then came the oaths. These were not casual promises made in the warmth of wine. Viking oaths were binding, as sacred as the carved runes that marked stones. A groom might swear to provide for his bride, to defend her and their household with his life. A friend might swear loyalty, vowing to support the new couple through thick and thin. A father might pledge gifts of land, livestock, or tools to strengthen the new home. And once spoken, these words were unbreakable. To break an oath was to invite ruin, for the gods themselves were thought to enforce them. The act of drinking sealed the vow. A man lifted his horn, spoke his promise, and drained the mead in one long pull. As the honeyed liquid slid down, it carried the words from his lips into his soul. The empty horn was proof. There was no going back. Mead, sweet and intoxicating, became the glue of honor, binding tongue to heart, heart to action. But ritual didn't mean solemnity alone. Between oaths, laughter erupted. Horns clinked, and sometimes boasts flew thick. A warrior might rise and brag of his victories, daring others to outdo him. A skald might compose verses on the spot, praising the couple with humor and wit. These performances weren't empty entertainment. They were offerings of spirit, part of the sacred rhythm of the night. And when the bride and groom shared their horn, the moment carried special weight. It was a private promise made in public view, a declaration that they would share burdens, joys, and futures together. Guests watched closely, for this act was the beating heart of the marriage ritual. To drink together, to drain the horn was to say, "We face the world as one." The ritual stretched late into the night. Mead flowed, oaths mounted, and the hall echoed with voices raised in faith, love, and sometimes drunken challenge. But even the wildest moments carried an undertone of reverence. Everyone knew that words spoken with a horn in hand would echo far beyond the timber walls of the hall. In the Viking world, swords defended the body, but oaths defended the soul. And at a wedding, both were needed. As the feast and oaths carried on, the longhouse pulsed with another kind of life, music, rhythm, and the lyrical art of words. For Vikings, a wedding wasn't complete without the sounds of instruments, the shuffle of dancing feet, and the soaring verses of skalds, the poets who shaped words into magic. These performances were not background noise. They were living rituals, gifts offered to the bride and groom, and a way of weaving the community into one body of sound and movement. Imagine the firelight flickering against carved wooden walls, while the hum of voices softens and a skald rises, cloaked in furs, harp, or lyre in hand. He begins to recite verses crafted for the occasion. His words don't just tell stories, they paint them. Heroes of old stride across his lines. The gods themselves appear, blessing the new union. And between myth and legend, the bride and groom become part of the tale. Skaldic poetry was never generic. It was personal, a way of binding the couple's names to the eternal chain of memory. The poetry could be lofty and formal, but it could also be playful. Jests, riddles, and sly references filled the verses, keeping the crowd laughing while honoring the couple. In a world where stories carried more permanence than ink, these performances were a legacy. To be immortalized in poetry was to be remembered long after the feast's last embers cooled. And then came the music. Viking instruments were simple but powerful. The lyre's strings plucked out steady melodies. Wooden flutes added breathy tones. Drums set the beat, their deep thump echoing like the heart of the hall. Even horns might sound, their calls blending with the laughter and song. Together, they built a tapestry of sound that stirred the guests from their benches. When the rhythm grew strong enough, dancing began. Not choreographed steps as we might imagine today, but circles, stomps, and spins. Men and women moved in patterns that shifted between solemn ritual and wild release. Some dances carried symbolic meaning, spirals for the turning of fate, circles for unity. But others were simply joyous, a chance to burn off the mead and roast meat. Children darted between adults, mimicking steps, learning through play the same traditions that their parents had once danced. The bride and groom often led a dance. Their movements watched closely. In every step, the guests read omens. Did the couple move in harmony? Did they laugh together? A stumble might draw a joke, but it was also a reminder. Marriage would demand balance, grace, and recovery after every misstep. In the warmth of the firelight, with drums echoing like distant thunder, the dance became a mirror of the life they were stepping into. Not everyone was a skald. Not everyone a dancer, but everyone participated in some way. Clapping, stomping, chanting, every voice and hand added to the whole. The longhouse became a living instrument, its beams vibrating with sound, its rafters carrying the echoes of music and verse. Even the gods, it was believed, could not resist joining in, their unseen presence swaying with the dancers and listening to the poetry offered in their names. The night stretched long, But no one noticed the passing of time. The skald's verses wound through the air like smoke. The music beat like a pulse, and the dance turned the hall into a whirl of bodies and joy. For that night, the wedding wasn't just a union of two people. It was a union of voices, feet, hearts, and memories, all woven into sound. Because in the Viking world, music wasn't decoration. It was magic. And at a wedding, magic was exactly what everyone needed. If the vows bound the couple and the feast sealed the joy, then the exchange of gifts cemented the union in the eyes of the community. Viking weddings were not merely about two hearts choosing one another. They were also about families, wealth, and alliances. And so, gifts carefully chosen, publicly given became a vital part of the ritual. The dowry, first and foremost, came from the bride's family. This was not a token, but a substantial offering, often consisting of land, livestock, household goods, and finely crafted items. A chest of silver coins might accompany her, or bolts of precious cloth dyed in rare colors. To send a daughter into marriage without a proper dowry was seen as shameful. The dowry represented her family's honor and their faith in the new bond. It also gave the bride herself a form of security, something she could claim as her own, even in her husband's household. But the groom's family also had obligations. They were expected to give the munder a bride price, a form of payment that acknowledged the value of the match and compensated the bride's kin for losing one of their own. This wasn't a crude purchase, but rather a symbolic balancing of accounts. Marriage, in Viking society, was an alliance between families, and the munder ensured that both sides entered the union on equal footing. The gifts didn't end there. Guests too were expected to bring offerings. A wedding was a communal event, and bringing a gift was a way of binding oneself to the newlyweds. Weapons, drinking horns, carved combs, and jewelry were common. Some gave practical items for the household, others tokens rich with meaning. A father might hand over a sword that had served him in battle, its blade carrying not only sharp steel, but years of memory and honor. A mother might present her daughter with a brooch, a piece that had fastened her own gown at her own wedding, a silent chain linking generations. The exchange of gifts was also a show of wealth and power. A chieftain might gift the couple with a ship or parcels of fertile land, his generosity underscoring his status. But even the poorest guests brought something, for to arrive empty-handed would be to insult the union and risk the disfavor of both families, and perhaps the gods themselves. More than wealth, though, the gifts carried symbolism. A plow given to the couple whispered of prosperity and fertile fields. A shield spoke of protection, a hope that the husband would guard his wife as fiercely as he would his kin. A loom or spindle was a blessing for domestic harmony and industry, while a drinking horn promised many more feasts shared among friends and kin. These gifts were not hidden away in private. They were given publicly, often announced by the skalds and witnessed by the entire community. To give a gift was to make a promise, a pledge of support to the new household. The gifts weren't only objects. They were binding threads, weaving families and allies into a tighter web. For the bride and groom, this moment was both humbling and empowering. Each gift received was a reminder that their union was not theirs alone. Behind them stood family, friends, neighbors, and gods, all investing in their future. To walk away from the feast with hands full of gifts was to carry more than possessions. It was to carry the weight of expectation, hope, and loyalty. When the last gift had been given, when the last promise spoken, the bride and groom stood transformed. They were no longer simply two individuals. They were a household, a new node in the vast web of Viking society. And their treasures, gold, weapons, land, and heirlooms, were tokens not just of wealth, but of the shared strength that would carry them through whatever storms might come. When the gifts had been exchanged and the vows spoken, there was still one more act to tie everything together. Fire for the Vikings. Fire was not merely warmth or light. It was a living force, a bridge between the human world and the divine. Fire carried prayers upward in smoke, consumed offerings, and purified all it touched. At weddings, fire became the final seal of blessing. Often, a great bonfire was kindled outside the longhouse, or in the open field where the feast had been held. The flames leapt high, licking at the dark northern sky, sparks rising like 1,000 tiny stars. Guests would gather around, their faces bathed in the glow, the night alive with shadows dancing on fur cloaks and wooden beams. The fire was not only a spectacle, it was a ritual. It symbolized the light of the gods shining on the new union, a beacon that would protect the couple in the years to come. Offerings were cast into the flames. A piece of bread, a cup of mead, a sliver of meat from the feast. These were gifts to the gods, carried by smoke to the heavens. Sometimes symbolic items were burned, sprigs of evergreen for eternal life, carved runes etched into wood with blessings of fertility and prosperity, even small tokens from the bride and groom's childhoods, sacrificed to mark their passage into a new stage of life. The bride and groom would often walk together around the fire, hand in hand, sometimes 3 times, sometimes 9. Numbers sacred to Norse tradition. Each circle was a step away from the past and toward their shared future. As they walked, the community might chant blessings or sing old songs, voices rising with the crackling of the fire. There were also smaller fires within the household. The hearth of the longhouse was considered sacred, a place where family and ancestors were honored. At weddings, a flame from the family hearth might be used to light the bonfire, ensuring that the ancestors' spirit guided the union. Likewise, the bride might carry a torch of that sacred flame into her new home, lighting the hearth there for the very first time. This act symbolized her role as keeper of the household, bringing warmth, nourishment, and life into the new family. Skalds sometimes spoke blessings by the fire, their verses weaving together honor for the gods, praise for the families, and hope for the couple. They might call upon Freyja for love and fertility, upon Thor for protection, upon Frigg for wisdom in marriage. The words, like sparks, were cast into the night, joining the fire's power to reach the divine. But the fire was not only about gods and ancestors, it was also about community. Guests would gather around the flames deep into the night, telling stories, laughing, sharing secrets. The heat of the fire mirrored the warmth of bonds being forged. For in Viking culture, marriage was as much about kin and neighbors as it was about the couple themselves. The bonfire was a glowing reminder that while the bride and groom would build a life together, they did so within a web of support that surrounded them like a shield. When at last the fire burned down to embers, many would take a coal or a small piece of ash home. These remnants carried the blessing of the ritual, a charm for good fortune, protection, and fertility. In this way, the wedding's sacred fire extended its reach far beyond the couple, touching every household that had been present. So the night ended not with silence, but with glowing coals and lingering warmth. The couple entered their new life with the gods' light behind them, ancestors' favor in their hearts, and the community's support at their side. And in the ashes of that sacred fire lay the promise of endurance. That just as fire could flare, fade, and flare again, so too would their bond weather the storms of time and burn brightly through the long winters to come. When the vows were spoken and the sacred fire lit, the true heart of a Viking wedding revealed itself, not in solemn words, but in the roar of laughter, the clink of cups, and the thunder of voices raised in song. Feasting was not an afterthought. It was the celebration, the living proof that bonds had been sealed, and joy was to be shared. Longhouses would be prepared for days in advance. Benches lined with furs, tables sagging under the weight of roasted meats, steaming stews, and baskets of bread. Mead flowed, as though the gods themselves had opened their cellars. To go hungry or thirsty at such a gathering was unthinkable. A wedding feast was a display of generosity, a chance for the hosting families to prove their wealth and their honor. The more food and drink they provided, the stronger their reputation grew. But food was only the beginning. Music filled the hall, often led by skalds who carried harps, lyres, or simple drums. Songs told stories of gods and heroes, battles and voyages, but also of love, tragic and triumphant. Guests joined in, their voices layering together until the rafters trembled. These songs were not just entertainment. They were blessings in their own right, weaving the couple's new life into the fabric of myth and memory. Games and contests soon followed. Wrestling matches broke out in the yard, testing strength and earning cheers. Drinking competitions turned into rowdy challenges, with men and women alike boasting of their stamina. Even riddles and clever wordplay had their place, as wit was as admired as muscle. Every laugh, every challenge, every song was a thread in the tapestry of the wedding celebration. And of course, toasts were made. The newlyweds drank together, sealing their bond before all, and guests raised horns of mead to honor them. But toasts were not limited to the living. Many were raised to the ancestors, to the gods, to luck and prosperity. Each horn emptied was a prayer as much as a promise. As night deepened, the hall grew wilder. Voices carried into the dark as stories flowed faster than the mead. Old rivalries were sometimes healed in the spirit of celebration, or inflamed when too much ale loosened tongues. Both were expected. A Viking wedding was as much about raw honesty as it was about formality. To celebrate without restraint was to honor the moment fully. And so the night stretched on. The fire roared in the hearth. Shadows danced on the walls, and the couple themselves became symbols of the night's joy. They sat among friends and kin, sharing in the endless toasts, their hands never far apart. The feast was not simply about them. It was about weaving them into the larger web of kinship, song and shared memory. By dawn, the hall was heavy with the scent of smoke, spilled mead, and fading laughter. Guests slumped on benches, some asleep, others still humming songs between snores. The newlyweds would retreat at last. But the feast itself lingered in every full belly and every hoarse voice. In the Viking world, marriage was sacred, but so too was celebration. And in those endless nights of feasting and song, the union was not only blessed but made unforgettable. If the feasting was the fire that warmed the hall, then the giving of gifts and oaths was the iron that forged the bonds. Viking weddings were not simply private unions of two people. They were contracts between families, sealed with promises, exchanges, and the weight of obligation. Gifts were never random. Each one carried meaning, chosen carefully to reflect not only wealth but also intention. A father might give a chest of silver, not as a flashy display, but as security for his daughter's future. A brother might hand over a fine sword, symbolizing his pledge to defend the new alliance. Jewelry, carved drinking horns, livestock, even land itself. All could change hands, each a declaration in material form. The richer the gifts, the stronger the reputation of the giver, and the more enduring the bond, but the deeper current lay in the oaths. Vikings swore with words that bound as tightly as chains. Standing before witnesses, men and women alike made promises to protect, to support, to remain loyal. Breaking an oath was not simply dishonorable, it was a spiritual wound, an affront to the gods themselves. At a wedding, oaths of kinship were as important as vows of love. A bride might promise to manage the household wisely, while a groom swore to provide and defend. Their kin too swore to uphold the alliance, to stand together in times of need. These oaths were often spoken with one hand on a sacred object, a family heirloom, a weapon blessed by sacrifice, or even a ring kept at a temple. The act transformed mere words into sacred commitments. Those present did not forget. Every guest became a witness, ensuring that no vow could later be denied. And yet, the ceremony of gifts and oaths was not all stern formality. There was joy in the exchange, laughter in the promises, a sense of weaving a net of kinship tighter with every gesture. The bride's family might present livestock to the groom's household, imagining fat calves and woolly sheep thriving in new pastures. The groom's kin might gift finely woven cloth, the shimmer of dyes catching the firelight, a promise that their home would always be clothed in plenty. Children, too, were often given small tokens. A bracelet, a carved toy, a handful of coins, as a sign that the next generation was already part of the pact. These small gestures mattered. They reminded all that a wedding was not simply for the bride and groom, but for the continuity of the family line. The act of giving and swearing was not one-sided. It was a cycle, a dance of obligation and gratitude. The hosts who gave great gifts received honor in return, while those who swore bold oaths won respect for their courage. In this exchange, wealth was not diminished, but transformed into something greater: trust, loyalty, and shared destiny. By the end of this ritual, the hall was not simply full of merriment. It was full of invisible cords tying family to family, guest to guest, and everyone present to the gods who had been invoked. A Viking wedding was never only about two people. It was a web of relationships tightened, a fortress of alliances built not with stone, but with words, gifts, and sacred trust. For the Vikings, a wedding was not complete without trial, because joy, in their world, was always balanced with the weight of challenge. Marriage was not a gentle bond but a contract forged in the same way a blade was tested, through fire, strain, and the threat of breaking. The celebrations were meant to be joyous, but beneath the laughter, there was always a reminder that fate was watching, and fate demanded proof. Some of these trials were symbolic. The groom, for instance, might be asked to lift a great sword before the assembled guests, not to fight, but to show strength enough to defend his household. In other regions, he might leap a fire pit, the blaze symbolizing the burning away of weakness, while his new bride watched with pride, or quiet doubt if his courage faltered. These were not games. They were small but meaningful signs that he was fit to carry the weight of responsibility. The bride, too, faced her own tests. Though hers were often woven into ritual rather than spectacle, she might be tasked with carrying a heavy chest of linens or household goods, showing she was strong enough to manage her new home. Or she might be challenged with a riddle or verse, proving her wit and wisdom. Sometimes she was asked to take a seat of honor by the hearth, and how she greeted her new kin revealed whether she would be a bridge or a wedge between families. Then there were the darker trials, the ones whispered of but not always performed. Some tales speak of mock duels, staged fights between the friends of bride and groom, meant to test the resolve of both families. In others, omens were drawn from the crackle of fire, the flight of birds, or the behavior of dogs prowling outside the hall. If the signs turned ill, people took note, for to ignore fate was to invite ruin. Guests themselves sometimes joined in contests of strength and endurance, wrestling, stone lifting, or axe throwing. These games were not only for entertainment, but reminders that life itself was a struggle, and that the newly joined families would need to be hardy and united if they wished to thrive. The winners earned honor, the losers earned laughter, but everyone understood the deeper lesson. Strength was not just personal, it was communal. But perhaps the greatest trial of all was the feast itself for hours. Sometimes days. The newlyweds and their kin were expected to endure endless toasts, eat their share of food, and keep their composure, even as the hall roared with drunken challenge and jest. A man who could not hold his ale was thought weak. A bride who grew weary or withdrew too soon was considered ill, prepared for the hardships of married life. What to us might seem like merrymaking was, to them, a form of testing. By the end of these trials, the couple stood not as untested strangers, but as proven partners. Their endurance, their strength, their wit, all had been displayed before the eyes of kin, friends, and gods alike. To survive the tests was to prove that fate, for now, smiled upon them. To falter was not always doom, but it planted seeds of doubt, whispers that could follow a household for years. The Vikings understood that no life was free from struggle. By building trials into the wedding, they reminded everyone present that hardship was not an exception. It was the rule, and if a couple could weather their first night together under fire and watchful eyes, then perhaps they could weather the storms yet to come. When the fires burned low and the horns of mead finally grew silent, the Viking wedding did not end in a blaze of glory but in the soft light of dawn. The hall smelled of smoke, roasted meat, and spilled ale. Guests snored on benches, warriors slumped over shields, and hounds curled at their masters' feet. Yet for the bride and groom, this moment was no less important than the feasting and the trials. It was the quiet, after the storm, the first breath of their new life together. The dawn after a wedding carried its own weight of meaning. For many, it was a time of ritual. In some traditions, the bride and groom rose early, washed in cold water to symbolize cleansing, and made offerings at the family shrine. A sprig of evergreen, a carved amulet, or even a lock of hair might be given to the gods. These gestures were small but vital, for no Viking wished to begin marriage without divine favor. The community, too, played a role in this mourning. Families might gather to witness the couple's first steps outside the hall as husband and wife. Sometimes, the bride was presented with a set of keys, the symbol of her authority over the household. She was no longer merely a daughter or sister. She was now mistress of her new home, and with those keys came responsibility. For the groom, this dawn marked his duty as provider and defender. He was expected to uphold his family's honor, guard his wife, and ensure the prosperity of their household. But dawn also revealed the other side of marriage, the practical, unromantic reality that lay beneath the feasts and vows. From that day forward, the bride might live under the watchful eyes of in-laws, sometimes in a hall that was not her own. She would need to prove herself daily through her skill, patience, and wisdom. The groom would return to his duties, whether farming, raiding, or trading, now carrying the weight of a partner who relied on him. What was celebrated in joy now had to be lived in work. The morning after was also a reminder of mortality, for in the Viking world, joy was always shadowed by fate. No one knew how long the union would last. A husband might sail and never return, a wife might fall ill, or war might scatter families apart. The dawn, though gentle, whispered of the future's uncertainty. It told the newlyweds that they had not been bound for ease but for endurance. And yet, there was beauty in that fragility. As the sun rose over the village, casting gold on the thatched roofs and icy fjords, the couple began their life as one. Their hands, once joined before gods and kin, were now joined in the tasks of everyday living, tilling fields, tending fires, raising children. The wedding had been the storm. This dawn was the calm sea that followed, offering them a chance to steer together into whatever lay ahead. So, the Vikings did not see the morning after as the end of a celebration, but as the true beginning of the marriage. It was the moment when words became deeds, when ritual gave way to reality, and when two people, bound by oath and trial, faced the world side by side. For in their eyes, love was not merely found. It was built, tested, and lived, day after day, until fate itself called an end.